kind of give you an idea of what we're going to be heading into for the next few minutes. So in 1782, Natchez Governor Grand Prix wrote to Spanish Louisiana Governor Miro that the Americans coming down the Ohio River were Americans by birth but not by sentiment. Their conduct in America was always that of people who placed themselves on the strongest side, now one, now the other, according to the success of the belligerent powers. 1788, between two Spanish officers, correspondence says that those who are coming down the Ohio River into the backlands of the territory are for the most part Americans devoted to the expelled English government or recent immigrants from Europe without any attachment to the United States. 1789, James Robertson of Nashville writes to Governor Miro, Spanish Louisiana, "We have just held a convention which has agreed that our members shall insist on being separated from North Carolina. Unprotected, we are to be obedient to the new Congress of the United States, but we cannot but wish for a more interesting connection. The United States affords us no protection. The district of Miro is daily plundered, and its inhabitants murdered by the Creeks and the Cherokee. Your removing the savages would ever bind us to remain a grateful people. For my own part, I highly conceive of the advantages of your immediate government." So with those three quotes there, we start to get an idea that things were not exactly as straightforward maybe as what we're taught or what we tend to understand about identity, whether that be in a cultural sense or in a political sense. Now, why is identity important? Why is this important to understand, especially in the late 18th century? Well, identity in any perspective is important to understand. It's important to understand where you come from. It's important to understand what decisions were made, what beliefs were held that led your forefathers to the point that you are the way you are today. Because in the same way, decisions you make are going to affect generations down the road. And so we're going to look at these 4 points about identity on the Tennessee frontier, namely that it is ambiguous. It's hard to define. It's hard to put it in a black and white sense. That it's also very localized. We're going to see some examples of how Tennessee frontier identity tended to remain on a local scale within a community with no strings attached to any larger political entity. We're going to also look at the frontier culture that had emerged over the previous 100 years prior to Nashville being settled in 1780 and what that meant. And then just how negotiable the idea of identity really was. Okay, so to give you a little background on why we understand it the way we do today, which is in a very black and white sense. It really comes down to this one article or this thesis that was published in 1891 by a guy named Frederick Jackson Turner. He published something called the Frontier Thesis. And what this basically states is that the American frontier, that experience, is unique to America. And that experience is what makes Americans the way they are today. It's why we understand the democratic process the way that we do. This process of turning savagery into civility, whether that be by civilizing native groups or by carving out the wilderness, cutting down trees, building enclosures, that sort of thing. And most of our Tennessee history throughout the late 19th century into the early 20th century follows that pretty hard. But secondly, it's heavily romanticized. A lot of the individuals in our history are blown up to these epic proportions. They're heroes. They save the settlements, those sorts of things. And these heroes, and I always find this very interesting, it's along with the polarized here on our next one, or second one down there, the understanding of what they did and how they acted towards natives and then towards the federal government is seen in a very black and white sense, when indeed it has to be seen in a very immense gray area, because these late 19th century, early 20th century historians tended to say, well, yeah, they were Indian fighters because the Indians needed killing, but at the same time, they were great champions of Indian rights later on when it came time for removal, David Crockett, for instance. And so there seems to be a difficulty that you can see them even encountering, whether they were consciously or unconsciously doing this, but trying to look at it in too black and white of terms. Traditional Tennessee history and really frontier history in general is also very Anglo-centric, meaning that if you were not English descent white guy, you're not really talked about. And so we have to pay a lot of attention to the fact that the British were actually very latecomers to the scene of the Trans-Appalachian West. We have various native nations. We have the French. The French that are in from 1682 to 1763. See, the British are only here from 1763 through 1783. Spain's in the Mississippi Valley from 1763 through 1797, unofficially through 1805. Then the U.S. comes in 1783. So this is kind of the area we're talking about. Got a laser pointer there. Y'all see the little red dot there? All right. Okay, so here's the Cumberland River. Here's the Tennessee River. And all of its headwaters, the Savannah, up to the Wabash, and here's the Mississippi through here. So all of this area through here was claimed by France through the 7 Years' War when they were removed from the continent. And even though they were officially removed, we still have a French presence. The British take the French posts in Illinois and along the Ohio River. The majority of your inhabitants are still French. The French are who have been utilizing this area. We have the native nations, the Cherokee, the Chickasaws, the itinerant Shawnee through here, the Creek, two Creek nations through here, are all utilizing this area, and they've had a tradition of utilizing this area. If you remember what Chris Ray was saying at the last meeting, you can't neglect the native role in this story. Now, what this sets us up for is that because of the way that those regimes change so frequently, there was no hard authority in the Ohio Valley. When I say Ohio Valley, it includes the Cumberland and the Tennessee River. But there was no hard authority. So even though France is here, I think in the Mississippi Valley alone, there was less than several hundred people for most of the time France was here. When Britain is here, you're looking at just the military garrisons in Illinois or Fort Loudoun in East Tennessee. So there's nothing to assert any kind of hard control on the people that are here. And so they are allowed to continue developing this unique identity within this unique experience. So just to kind of give you some examples of some ways that this developed. In the 1730s, we had this guy named Christian Preber, who is a Saxon or a German immigrant. Now, he's a whole other wonderful story in and of himself. And he migrated here for utopian purposes to establish this utopian colony, so to speak, in and amongst the Cherokee. But here we have a guy who was immensely capable of running back and forth on the sliding scale of civility to savagery, that he could don Cherokee attire, tattoos and makeup, a breech clout, and shave his hair, and was accepted within the town that he was part of, as part of that clan that was there. Yet he could still put on his breeches and his waistcoat and his tricorn hat and head over to the Carolinas to trade, speak the language, and he can move fluently and effortlessly back and forth in between those. You're going to see a lot more of that as the 18th century progresses. Another example, 1749, Céloron de Bienville is coming down the Ohio River. He is a French diplomat, and they are trying to assert their claim in the Ohio River by planting these lead plates. That groovy guy there is holding right there. These lead plates are going to be planted or buried at the mouths of all the major streams coming off of the Ohio River. So he comes across a trading post. And at this trading post, what does he see? He sees a French flag and a British flag flying simultaneously. He finds British hunters hanging out with French hunters, hanging out with natives that are allied with both sides. And so, of course, being the staunch French diplomat that he is, he makes them take down the British flag. Very angry at the situation and moves on. Of course, this isn't the only time he finds this in the Ohio Valley. But while he insisted these flags be taken down, he failed to understand the complexity that he was actually in the midst of. Being that in a region of no hard authority, trade is the dialect. Loyalties were to kin groups and communities, and anything else is negotiable. And so it's this ambiguity and fluidity of identity that controlled much of the dynamics that we see in the 1780s and 90s. Okay, and so factors of identity, I've kind of broken them down into three different categories. Origin, where are they from? What kind of community? This is an important one. Experience with and proximity to native communities. And then the third one being alignment with local leadership. And alignment with local leadership is actually what we're going to see most of our concepts and understandings of identity on the frontier falling underneath. So with origin, not all, but most of the settlements that come into the Middle Tennessee area are going to be of a Scots-Irish descent. And these settlements would have previously located from what's now Western Virginia, Southwest Virginia, Western Carolina, or now East Tennessee. These types of communities were oftentimes only first and second generation American, meaning that a lot of the folks who moved here, their fathers or grandfathers were actually born overseas. But they retained very clan-like structures, an insult to your cousins, an insult to you. Kinship ties are what binds communities together. But there's also, along with our third point a second ago, there is an alignment with local leaders that's based on provision and protection. And this is a very important point because if protection is provided in a physical sense, and it's also provided in a sense of maintaining trade and commerce, that's who you're going to see people aligning with, regardless of where they actually stand or who they're aligned with. We have the experience with the native communities, and this one I find exceptionally fascinating. Richard White published a book back in the mid-1980s. It's called The Middle Ground, and he's actually referencing, referring to the Great Lakes region and the way that natives and French coureurs de bois and voyageurs had this new culture emerge of their attempts to function in this new world that was there. And so it applies here in some ways. And so to define that, this middle ground, it consisted of creative misunderstandings in which Europeans and Indians attempted to build a set of mutually understandable practices. Requires a non-functioning or a weak state of authority, and we've already established that either that there is a weak state of authority, but there are no hard talons into what's actually going on in the interior region. Has to be a relatively evenly balanced distribution of power between peoples. The inability of one side to effectively use force over the other, and the need or desire to interact with one another, such as for trade goods. Another historian, Cynthia Comfer, states this. I find this to be very telling. That for decades, the boundaries between Native Americans and Western peoples were quite porous. In addition to the treaty meetings, Cherokees and the other Native peoples commonly visited white farms, taverns, and towns, socialized with their neighbors, traded with them, warned them of impending attacks, helped them when they were lost in the woods, and lived with them. They stole horses and committed other interracial gang violence. Former hostages and captors visited each other. Whites traded in Cherokee villages and attended green corn dances there. Individual Cherokee, as well as the Cherokee Nation, occasionally used the white newspapers to assure the white community of their peaceful intentions, to return lost or strayed white property, to advertise for escaped slaves, to air their differences with whites, and even engage in intertribal disagreements. I think you can go as far as to say that not in all cases, but especially in the southern Trans-Appalachian frontier, by the time you get to the 1770s, there is a high probability that you would not have been able to material culture-wise tell the difference between a white community and a native community. There's certainly going to be differences, by all means, but there had been so much assimilation in between the two cultures, just as Ms. Comfort describes them as being porous. There is cosmologies and understandings that of the world around them that are being adopted back and forth. And this has taken place over 100 years. So this wasn't something that just pops out of nowhere. All right. So yeah, again, this is not a new concept. This is something that had been developing, as we saw with Prevost, as we saw with Celeron's experience down the Ohio River. Anytime that there's not the hardline authority present, things get ambiguous. And they latch onto one of those three means of identity. And so, yeah, without ambiguity or the lack of loyalty, these following examples would not have been possible. So I want to go into now three different examples of how we can see this ambiguity in identity applied. Okay, so we have the Spanish conspiracy. And this is one, if you're a student of Tennessee history, you've heard it a million times. And really, I even have a problem with the term conspiracy because that even goes back to our 19th century, early 20th century historians placing things in black and white, that if you're operating in some sort of manner that's contradictory to the U.S. government at that time, which, by the way, was brand new, why in the world would you trust it? You don't know yet how it's going to work, especially in the West. A conspiracy implies something bad, or treason, or intrigue. All those terms are used. And so this was Spanish Louisiana's attempt to create a buffer state or a region between Spanish Mississippi Valley and the new states east of the Appalachian Mountains. During the era of 1763 through the end of the Revolution, this area of Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia had been largely unoccupied. And so there was no threat to any kind of sovereignty that Spain held there. There was no threat to Americans coming in, taking the river by force, as they would later try to do. But they contested the American claim to free navigation of the Mississippi River. And so they closed it in 1785. And this would actually be an important point later in Tennessee's statehood. Free navigation of the Mississippi River was so important that Tennesseans wrote it into our first Tennessee Constitution and claimed it to be a free, unalienable right to navigate the Mississippi River. Without the river, the Cumberland River is useless. The Cumberland River ultimately leads to the Mississippi. The Tennessee ultimately leads to the Mississippi. And so in order for places like Nashville to survive, to engage in any sort of large-scale commerce, access to that Mississippi River has to be present. And so after 85, they do make provisions to use the river, but provided that you became Catholic, which is an ultimate no-no for all the Scots-Irish Protestants that are here. They pay 15% duty on what they're taking down the river, which oftentimes meant that the trip didn't pay for itself. Or you could actually come and locate into the Spanish territory. They'd give you land grants. You could practice Protestantism as long as you practice it in your house and not in public. During this time, though, we see settler discontent growing with North Carolina. In fact, they tried to cede the territory in 85 to the federal government. It doesn't work at that point. But from 85 into 89, there's a series of negotiations between Gardocki and Jay to open up a commercial treaty with Spain across the Atlantic, provided that Spain could keep the Mississippi River closed. Well, the federal government attempted to do that. And so when you have your federal government that's not protecting you from native attack, and they are allowing the Spaniards to shut down the Mississippi River in favor of a treaty that would allow commerce across the Atlantic, I would probably be a little upset too. And so we see this growing, and this grows and grows and grows into several land speculators who are guys like James White. You'll see Blunt is loosely involved with this, John Sevier, James Robertson, all the guys we know and love are involved in this in some capacity. These land speculators have land values they have to maintain, they want to maintain in order to maintain their fortune. And oftentimes they would go, or attempted to go to the Spanish, get the Spanish to take over the territory, or to convince settlers here to relocate to Natchez or to Walnut Hills. In 1790, we see the South Carolina Yazoo Company trying to moved settlers out of Middle Tennessee. Had James Robertson, John Sevier, George Rogers Clark all signed on to it to move all these people down to Spanish territory. So what we got. So these land speculators knew how easily swayed your land poor settler group was here. Knowing that they needed protection in both the areas we talked about, this could provide it. Spain could provide protection from the Indians, which, by the way, Spain was actually funding and feeding the native attacks into the area from the Creek and Chickamauga specifically, as a way of kind of pushing the American settlers into Spaniard arms. So they see this as a means of securing their ability to continue to make money in the West, if as long as they can get the Western settlers to go along with it. And so there's a lot of negotiation on this line over several years. And it actually continues all through the 1790s. Cumberland, kind of the Miro district, leaves the conspiracy picture about 1789, though it's still talked about for the next several years. Kentucky is involved in it. State of Franklin's involved in it. Bourbon County, Georgia is involved in it. So basically everything south of the Ohio River and west of the Appalachian Mountains attempted to join Spanish Louisiana at some point or in some capacity. Give you some of the players here. Here's Governor Miro from 1785 to 1791 of Spanish Louisiana, who was immediately followed by Baron de Carondelet. And some of our guys, again, we know and love: James Robertson, father of Nashville; John Sevier; James Wilkinson, general in the American Army, who is really the architect behind all of this. So we have here a situation that happened because the settlers here are looking for alignment with somebody that will provide protection and physical protection and protection in trade. Spaniards could provide that, or at least it seems so. So we see for the people that are here on the ground living in Nashville, around the French Lick, the idea of leaving the United States was not an issue. It had there was no sense of patriotism yet in Americans. That doesn't come about really for another 25 years or so after the War of 1812. But for these folks here, what they're concerned about is surviving. How am I going to survive? How is my settlement going to survive? How am I going to make money? How am I going to be able to stay where I am at? And so that's what's informing their decisions for loyalties, for alignment. We mentioned earlier that individuals are aligning underneath specific leaders regardless of where they stand, because that leader has taken care of them. So that's what we're going to get into in just a second here, specifically the Genet Affair, 1793 and 94. After the French Revolution and the French Girondist government that has come into power has sent an ambassador to the U.S., Edmond Charles Genet. He has a plot to raise a French army on the North American continent to take Spanish posts, force Spain off the North American continent because of situation that's brewing in Europe. And so part of this involves sending a botanist into the West, a guy named André Michaud, to actually covertly hand out commissions. And George Rogers Clark is commissioned as the, here he is, he's commissioned as the general of this army. Then there's this guy named John Montgomery in Clarksville, Tennessee, or what's now Clarksville, Tennessee, up the river, hears about this. He had served under Clark in the Northwestern campaigns in the Revolution, had undying loyalty to this man. And so when he hears that Clark's about to embark on this expedition, he's in, guns blazing. And not just because he's aligned with this guy so heavily and so loyal, but also it's an effort to open the Mississippi River for good. So he's accomplishing safety and security for his settlement. Now Montgomery is particularly fascinating because he's an individual who is Scots-Irish descent. He fights in the American Revolution. He over the course of his career, would have encountered likely a dozen different native communities all over the interior southeast and Ohio Valley. He likely spoke enough of each of those languages in order to do negotiation and trade and diplomacy with all these individuals. He dealt with French communities in Kaskaskia and Cahokia and Vincennes. He dealt with Spanish up and down the lower Mississippi River, yet he could still turn on the civility just enough to head back to Williamsburg occasionally. And so this individual, when he actually settles in Clarksville after the war, he encounters what's already an illegal settlement on property that he owns, but instead of doing what anybody else would have done, which is ejected him in court, which happened frequently, he builds a blockhouse in the middle of them and takes responsibility for the settlement. I think you could even see it as somewhat of as a sense of benevolence. I don't know that that's the right word for it, but maybe akin to that. He hunts for that community. He takes care of them to some degree. But at the same time, a few years later, he's willing to uproot and move down to Natchez with no explanation. That doesn't work out. He comes back, rebuilds the settlement even stronger. And then in 93, we talked about how all the settlers here are largely discontent with the federal government policy on the Mississippi River. And additional to that, they said, Native Americans, that's a defense only now. You're only to attack if they attack you, and they wouldn't be attacking you if you weren't crossing all the lines. So there's a pretty substantial disconnect right there. So when this plot comes about via Genet and Clark to start taking post, again, Montgomery jumps at the chance. He raises basically the entirety of the Red River community, which is north of here. So all this watershed through here, there's several settlements to this, and good indicators that most, I wouldn't say all, but most of them are involved in following Montgomery. We have stores in Clarksville that are issuing credit on behalf of the French nation in order to build up supplies. They're building boats big enough to hold cannons. And so even though the entirety of the Genet affair, nothing ever materializes of it anywhere else except right here. Montgomery and all of his men out of Clarksville and Red River come up here, they build a blockhouse, and they start taking Spanish boats. And nobody could really believe that he was actually doing this. And what's neat is seeing the dialogue that's happening at that time where Spain starts to take it seriously. They start to write to Washington and to Knox, the Secretary of War, saying, you got to stop this guy, or we're going to handle him, and you're not going to like how we're going to handle him. The federal government, their response is saying, no, this is treasonous activity, this is outrageous activity. Governor Blunt is even saying that they will be corporally punished for this. So very black and white remarks there. Yet 5 months later, after Shawnee attacked his blockhouse and he's removed out of there, 5 months later, he's leading the charge at Nickajack, the attack that's on the Cherokee villages down around Chattanooga. And even today, in local tradition of the area, he's highly revered. So where's the disconnect there? Well, why is he all of a sudden this treasonous individual who is worthy of corporal punishment, but yet when it comes down to defending the settlement at large, he's one of the guys that is turned to? And I think that comes down to the fact that on the local level here, they didn't care. They didn't care if you were aligned with the U.S. They didn't care if you were aligned with the French. They didn't care if you were aligned with the Spanish. What it came down to is, how are you providing for this settlement? How are you aligning with people that have done you well, done you good, as they would say in the past? How would you, their understandings of what kinship was, their understandings of what their world was local. Was not a national understanding at this point. And I would say even the people that are writing some of these letters, even Blunt and Robertson, are probably stating some of these things because they know that's what Washington wants to hear. This is actually a pretty cool map. It shows the blockhouse there at the mouth of the Cumberland and the Tennessee River from about 1807, right across from Fort Massac. That's Illinois, Mississippi, Kentucky. So one last one real quick. William Blount and the Blount Conspiracy. Now, William Blount was the territorial governor of the Southwest Territory from 1789 through 1796. And after that, he becomes the first senator from Tennessee. Now, Blount is a crooked guy in every regard, heavily involved in land speculation, covertly. And when I say land speculation, I'm not talking about just buying land. I mean, there's a lot of crooked dealings going on there. But he's the first U.S. politician to be impeached. The Blount conspiracy comes about when when Spain is defeated by France in the War of the Pyrenees. So there's this fear that France is going to take back the Mississippi River, which goes completely contradictory to what George Rogers Clark believed, but that they're going to take back the Mississippi River and shut off Tennessee and Kentucky access to that corridor. Well, if that's shut off, the land here becomes worthless. There's no way to get out product. So he made arrangements for Britain to take Florida and Louisiana by force, along with militias located here in Tennessee and Kentucky. Well, he was found out. A letter's intercepted at the Tellico Blockhouse. It makes its way all the way to Philadelphia. And then one day, as he's out taking a walk during the break, he comes back into the chamber, and they're all looking at him because they've read the letter. And he's accused. He bails and gets out of Dodge pretty quick. But he makes his way back to Tennessee. Now, you would think at this point that somebody who pulled that today, you would hope if I pull that today, I would never show my face in public again. You know, he comes back to Tennessee and he's welcomed. He is treated as another proponent of Tennessee. In fact, his reputation continues to remain positive through the next several years of his involvement in Tennessee's politics. And I think that comes down to, though what he was doing was for personal gain, it did ultimately benefit the state of Tennessee by keeping that river open. So, very short example, but I think it's a great example. Now, in conclusion of all this, I want to reiterate a few things. That identity and loyalty along the Cumberland River was far from firm. It was complex, it's nuanced, and it vacillated frequently. Those who were products of the frontier experience tended to align with community and kin first, followed by whomever could provide protection and safety and commerce. And over the 20 years of settlement in the Cumberland River Valley, this reality had real consequences in the territory's pursuit of alignment. More importantly, the Tennessee frontier experience was not a singular detached event, but was part of a larger trans-Appalachian experience. And this context is vital to understanding not just frontier identity in Tennessee, but the frontier identity experience in general. And that's all I have. If you have any questions.
Dave, just in the span of this history, we here at the River Center often find ourselves telling the story of Robertson's overland passage, arriving here around Christmas of 1779, about the same time at which John Donaldson and his flotilla launched from Fort Patrick Henry on a 1,000-mile journey down to Cumberland. My question to you is, what I don't know and I'm very curious about is, what was the relationship between these two men, Robertson and Donaldson, and how did the settlement of Nashville and these two respective journeys impact that relationship? We all know that among the notable passengers on Donaldson's flotilla was a future First Lady, Rachel Jackson.
Right.
But what was the relationship between these two men?
Well, personally, I could not say. Paul could probably actually give more on their personal relationship. But what I do know is that they are both under the employ of Richard Henderson. Okay? Richard Henderson is the individual who purchases the Transylvania Purchase. It's this attempt to create another colony. It's a land speculating endeavor. Nashville is settled, as were many of these settlements, were settled with the intent to have a way to have land surveys emanate from, to have a secure center point for land surveyors and for their startup communities to begin from. So Nashville and Boonesboro are very much akin. They're both infant cities in this Transylvania colony. Of course, that's immediately done away with by Virginia because of its legalities and such. But so as far as their business relationship, that's what I could say. Now, personally, I couldn't say any more. But any other questions? Ma'am?
We hear a lot about the migration down from the North New England states, like John Overton came, I believe, from upper New England. He wasn't satisfied there. He came from the surveying all and speculating all in that area. But who relayed the message that this was the vast open spaces to be conquered and to be, who was going back? Boone was, but who else?
Well, if you got to keep in mind that one of the things that we're often taught about, like the long hunters who come into this area in the 1760s and 70s, is that it's this undiscovered wilderness. And quite frankly, it was not undiscovered. That the French are moving back and forth, like Dr. Ray was saying last time we met. The French are coming back and forth across Tennessee on a regular basis. They're hunting through it. They're trading through it. Indian slavery is taking place here. And so it's not unknown. Now, permanent settlement-wise, yeah, it is unknown to permanent settlement. So you have initially your long hunters that are sending reports back about what it's like physically here. But one thing we always underestimate, and I always have to stop myself for a second, is we underestimate our ancestors' ability to travel and for news to travel. So newspapers are coming up. I think the Kentucky Gazette's 1787 thereabouts, which is not just real early, but of course the Knoxville Gazette comes about after the territory is established in '89. But there's still a lot of movement happening back and forth. I couldn't tell you specifically who, but records are chock full of individuals who are moving back and forth. It's just a matter of a couple of weeks usually before letters are received back in Carolina. Anybody else?
Could you elaborate on what you mean about the land speculation of, say, Henderson compared to what Blunt did?
Well, what Henderson was doing was really no different than any other land speculator at that point. It's the idea of acquire land cheaply and sell it off more expensively, make money that way. What Henderson was doing was taking an area that had very vague claims to it. The area of Kentucky in northern part, north of the Cumberland River, was claimed by Virginia. Parts of it are claimed by Pennsylvania. Parts of it are claimed by North Carolina at that point. Though they were, for all intents and purposes, their boundaries didn't move beyond the Appalachian Mountains. What Blunt did was he took proper territory that was already established as a state at that point and attempted to give it over to the British, if that makes sense. So while both are a little unscrupulous, Blunt's is more blatantly illegal. But with Henderson, his claim with the Transylvania purchase was invalidated very quickly. I think for his entire purchase, he was given something like 300,000 acres up on the Green River or the Ohio River, something like that, in return for that. Does that answer that? Yeah. Anything else? Okay.
David, we thank you very much for sharing with us a bit of the history of the Cumberland, and we would like to give you a photograph of a citizen who was here at the beginning and still with us, thankfully, Great Heron, and tell you how much we appreciate you doing this. Thank you. I'm Paul Sloan, and as of today, I'm chairman of the board of the Cumberland River Compact. I feel particularly buoyed because Mikhail Houghton is the executive director, and have we traded up or not? It's great. Thank you for coming. This is the second of the History of the Cumberland series. This has been a partnership with the Tennessee Historical Society, and Topovich, thank you so much. We do everything we do through partnership. As the African expression says, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. So we go together on this, and we're going far. Here at the River Center, we have our next one in the history series is going to be our native historian, Paul Clement. Raise your hand. You're going to anchor the third, and then after that, we're going to have a panel which Paul will lead that will include all our historians talking about the great story that is our origin here. The compact hopes to be one of many stewards of the river. Our mission is the health and enjoyment of the Cumberland River and all of the tributaries. It's a big task with only a staff of 6, but the area is remarkably, the drainage of the Cumberland River from Harlan, Kentucky, home of my in-laws, to Smithland, Kentucky, at the Ohio. The river is 694 miles, and the watershed itself is larger than New Jersey, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Over 10,000 miles of streams to care for. So that is all our charges, and all of you who are supporters of the compact, our hearts go out in thanks. Thank you very much. And those of you who may not yet be, please go to our website and become a member. Just become a member. The entry is really insignificant in dollars, but it just adds to the number of voices that we tell to anybody that comes by that this river is important to us all. And finally, I will tell you this mission of this center, which we're in and occupy now, this is a public resource. We all own it. It's a venue for your events, our events, educational programs that move the conversation about the importance of our waters forward. So please keep that in mind and think about your own organizations, whether there would be something you would like to do here. This belongs to the city, and it's a huge gift to us that came to us through well-funded visionaries who put this together, for whom we're very thankful. All of these conversations, all of this history program and others are part of what we call River Talks. And if you go to our website, you'll see a whole menu of River Talks that are hosted here. This is a history strand. We have an innovations and solutions strand that goes in some of the technical solutions that Nashville is exploring and best management practices that are happening here in Nashville to deal with our water issues. And those are great sessions. We have Travelers on the Cumberland, which is another whole series that we launched recently with a presentation by Vic Scoggin, who is a remarkable individual who lives here in Nashville and in 1996 swam from Harlan, Kentucky to Smithland, 694 miles. Swam the river to make a statement of the needs of the river, which was our origin. The next of those series, the Travelers on the Cumberland, will be on June 18th. And I recommend it to you. It's going to be really cool. I haven't met him, but the man's name is Kim Levithan. He's a professor at Maryville University, and he canoed the entirety of the Tennessee from its headwaters to the Ohio, and then he turned around and wrote a book about it. Then he canoed the entirety of the Cumberland River from Harlan, Kentucky, all the way to Smithland. And he wrote a book about that called Cold-Hearted River. And then he wrote another book about wandering throughout the country. Lord knows how he has time to teach. But he has a very unique perspective on our waters and what has happened and what has remained the same and what's changed. And his perspective, I think, will be interesting for all of us. So I encourage you to come to that on June 18th. As always, they are free. And then the next one on innovations and solutions that I mentioned, the strand to you earlier, on May 29th, we're having 4 years later, the 2010 flood and what we learned. And that'll be quite interesting. We have Scott Potter, who's the director, fantastic guy, hero of the flood, who will be on a panel together with a representative from the mayor's office and from the Corps of Engineers. So that'll be a three-way conversation that'll be interesting to us all. Go to the website, River Talks, sign up. And thank you so much for joining us for lunch. And I hope this is the first or second time of many to come. This is, I said to someone at lunch, I don't know whether this is a party or a lecture. And someone said, it's both. So, so thank you very much.